Earlier this summer, I found my way into a town called Rajpipla. It's about 3 hours from my home. I was visiting my friend Ranajay, who is a Master of Public Policy student at Georgetown, and whom I actually met because 2 of our friends were getting married to each other. We were supposed to travel to Pakistan for their wedding, but we did not make it because of COVID. However, we bonded over architecture, history, and heritage. Everything that an architect would love, but a public policy student? Anyway, Ranajay invited me to spend the weekend in Rajpipla and promised to show me some really good buildings. Not quite telling me at first that he belonged to the royal family of Rajpipla and that his ancestors had commissioned the buildings that we were going to see. So we saw the buildings and spoke extensively about patronage, culture, gentrification, and urban regeneration. And there was no way I was not recording it. So here's the first in-person interview of Architecture Off Center with Ranajay Chand. My name is Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight radical perspectives and unconventional projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Center features conversations with some exceptional individuals who have extrapolated the traditional design fields to unexplored frontiers. Well, can you describe the space and the place we're sitting in right now?
Are we starting?
Yeah.
Oh, great. We're sitting in the new wing of Vijay Palace, this wing was built in 1920, and Vijay Palace is my family's ancestral home and was the seat of the Maharaja of Rajpipla until the early 1940s when Vadiyar Palace was built, but essentially the place from which Rajpipla was governed for most of its golden years from 1915 to 1948.
You came back here with quite an entry and you have some big plans for the place. So what has been the story of the palace itself in terms of its life, and how are you thinking about it?
So, as I said, it was the seat of the Maharajas of Rajpipla until the early 1940s. After independence, at the time when my great-great-grandfather, for whom it was built, signed the Instrument of Accession, after he died, it passed on to my great-grandfather, who used it as his primary residence again. And it functioned as a residence until the early 1970s. By this time, my great-grandfather passed away and my grandfather was the Maharaja. In 1971, as our Indian listeners will be aware, Indira Gandhi, during the emergency, revoked all the titles and privileges, including the Privy Purses. So obviously, there had to be some form of running income to support the property, because obviously being a palace, it has its own maintenance needs and, pretenses to keep up. So it was turned into a hotel, and eventually it sort of became a popular-ish location for films to be shot. And that's what it was until I came back in 2017 and took over the management of the palace myself.
So when we talk about palaces in India and you think about their contemporary function, one realizes that mostly they're all turned into hotels and museums. Now that you're kind of overseeing the whole project and the place, what's your take on other maybe alternative uses of a place like this, especially within its current context? And for those who don't know, Rajpipla is located in quite close proximity to the Statue of Unity, which is now the world's largest statue, and it's been attracting a lot of attention. So there's two ways to think about it. One, this can really shoot up and this can go crazy and this can become a tourist hotspot. But the other day you were giving this example of how there's a front office and there's a back office. And if the Statue of Unity is what the front office is, there are chances of this being the back office. So not just the palace, but if you think about the town and its importance or its relevance today, what do you think about it?
So do you mean adaptive reuse of old buildings, including palaces, or the towns themselves?
Well, let's start with the building itself.
So luckily for me, I think I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do right from the get-go. And then even more luckily for me, I guess, Prime Minister Modi decided to build the Statue of Unity. And obviously it gives us this opportunity to piggyback off it, like to attract day tourists. Hence my idea to turn one wing of the palace into a museum. And I guess I'm more comfortable sort of selling culture more than like being in the hospitality industry, which I don't particularly understand. So I'd say I was lucky in knowing what I wanted to do. As for other palaces, I can't say know of too many. I think some of my other cousins who are more ingrained in these or more active in this area would be able to give a better answer as to what they do in India. But obviously in Rajasthan, it's hotels that are the sort of go-to option. Obviously, some forts and palaces have become museums, but obviously the family needs to have that sort of like treasure trove of cultural artifacts to be able to pull that off. There can usually only be one main museum in any city. So my idea to turn the palace, one wing of the palace into a museum also was based on the fact that Rajpipla in its current form, or at least at the time when I had come back, which was obviously a year before the statue opened, was that Rajpipla obviously had accommodation, but no attractions per se. So this would serve as the attraction, and it could have all the other owners of like historic homes in the city turn theirs into accommodation, sort of work in conjunction with each other and in harmony, more importantly. But yeah, when thinking of the adaptive reuse of a building, I think it's very important to consider what the building was used for originally, and obviously you can't tinker too much, as you as an architect would obviously be able to agree with. You can't tinker too much with its original design and purpose because it is designed keeping that in mind. So to whatever extent one I think should sort of try to limit maybe the building to its original use or something along those lines. But yeah, obviously we've seen some very interesting, discussing the Four Seasons in Florence as we were the other day, we've seen monasteries turn into hotels. So yeah, I guess it also depends on the context of its setting and the current events that are taking place, or the development at the time in the town, and how the building's adaptive reuse can play a role in shaping that. So again, depends on one's appetite for risk as well. So.
Can I press you on something you mentioned earlier?
Please do.
You said something about selling a product, and then you're talking about selling a certain kind of culture. I want to ask you what culture means for you today, especially a culture that, well, physically reminds you of a very specific past, but a past that exists only physically and maybe not in terms of its, I don't want to say traditions, but in its functioning, in its habits, in its food, its clothing, in its art, its people, its staff, its whatever. But what is this culture that you're talking about?
Oh, I just meant generally to sell a product that is cultural in nature, for example.
But what is cultural in nature today?
I mean, you could break down.
I mean, while we're doing this interview, you and I are both kind of completely dressed in Nike t-shirts. So while sitting in a 100-year-old palace, so I don't know. I often find this very thought-provoking and also confusing, because when we're trying to redefine something, or when we're trying to think about something in today's time with all the technology and all the social media and our artifacts of the past, including buildings only meant for the lack of a better word, just Instagram post. I mean, what is culture? Are we just like marinating in the past because we can't have it today? But I mean, I don't know.
I think it's an interesting juxtaposition sitting at Nike, obviously, in this room, but a privileged juxtaposition, if I can call it that. Drawing on our conversation from earlier and seeing how obviously architecture and products in general have like become more industrial post the Second World War. I think our current, like, if you're asking about the artifacts that these buildings are, I think they sort of, in the Indian context, in my personal opinion, they're like symbols of what I like to call indigenous high culture, and like sort of a symbol of a time when there was beauty in conception and execution. Well thought out spaces that were obviously very purpose built for the area they use, and everything obviously is compared to like modern architecture that's sort of exactly very similar to look at least. And I don't know, with the use of modern technology that's doesn't require to be like built in a different way for its environment. So I guess they serve as like not just reminders, but like they serve as symbols of that. If you look at most luxury products today, they tend to originate from countries or areas that have also tend to have very strict preservation laws. If you look at Italy, France and England, obviously they've got, their culture is preserved through their built environment. So I guess if you're talking with the buildings as artifacts of that, then yeah, sure. Indian culture obviously is evolving. It's rather global in its outlook in a way, but then obviously we have other forms of modern Indian culture as well. And obviously there is nothing like Indian culture because of like sub-national like cultures that we have in this country. So I mean, for me personally, I like to think of myself obviously as a value espouse, maybe aspire to be culture, to be able to appreciate different cultures, and obviously a certain set of beliefs, values that I have that are uniquely my own. And then obviously my behavior, I think, is a result of those. And any artifacts that I may end up creating might be, again, a result of those three. So I've just given you a breakdown of the cultural framework that I finished writing an essay on last week. So
Okay, but then when you think about culture and the way a lot of people, I mean, even just like if you speak about fashion or lifestyle products, it seems like culture and cultural products are being framed or reframed to cater to an exclusive few rather than them being inclusive, which I assume back in the day was something that was extremely inclusive, and that a lot of, I mean, of course, crafts have been lost over generations. But if you're trying to elevate a certain kind of culture, quote unquote, like the capital C, how do you try to make it inclusive? Like the other day when we were walking around and we saw these Art Deco houses in Rajpipla, absolutely bizarre, because I did not expect to see Art Deco buildings here. I thought they would all just probably be, palace-like bungalows with like slight colonial influences, but also very geometric and almost vernacular. Maybe like not the vernacular that you see in Ahmedabad, but still very local to the region. But then seeing all these Art Deco buildings and then seeing them being converted into what's happening literally all over India, just functional spaces that serve a certain kind of purpose to the users that they belong to. And kind of creating this awareness amongst the general public that this is worth preserving, for the lack of a better word. And in season 1, we had Karan, my friend from the GST, who is absolutely anti-preservation because he feels like culture evolves and history evolves and there's no need to be physically attached to buildings of the past. Different perspective, but what do you think about it?
Preserving culture or like...
No, just like it not being exclusive and somehow...
Oh, inclusive. How to make culture inclusive.
Or making people realize the value that it has in the day and time that we live in, where in places like Ahmedabad or literally anywhere in the world which has 48 degrees Celsius heat, you're still building glass buildings, right? Because that's the global culture, global broadly, where everything looks the same around the world.
So, how do you make sort of this part of Indian culture more...
I mean, let's just talk about Rajpipla and the culture you were thinking about.
I mean, obviously, the many cultural artifacts that one might have. You might have like the clothing of Rajpipla, you might have the architecture of Rajpipla, you might have the food of Rajpipla, you might have the jewelry of Rajpipla. It could be anything. But to make them, obviously, back in the day, everything, I suppose, if you look at any sort of luxury product that has a strong cultural influence today, more often than not, it will be handcrafted or made with obviously very... good materials at least, if not luxurious. And as the world has evolved, obviously most products nowadays are mass-produced, industrial products, and what's handcrafted is now reserved for the select few who can afford them. So to get everyone to buy into this sort of, speaking strictly about these sort of these artifacts of culture, obviously to get the masses to buy into them is almost impossible. But one way to make this sort of stuff not exclusive, maybe is not the correct word, but like to have a system that benefits all, is to get, considering the number of artisans we have, and including, for example, as we've spoken about him quite often, my tailor, to promote these as viable occupations for people so that they can gain from this, call it a cultural renaissance or whatever, but like there's this return to, like, to have the human touch again, to promote this humanism again in the artifacts of your culture. This is one way to make it more inclusive, is to, maybe through job creation and stuff, but obviously to have enough people buy into this is, at least in today's day and age, rather difficult, because it's very difficult to sell the idea of one of these to someone who maybe is still learning about it, and to justify the higher price of these to someone who, even if they can arguably afford it, against something that is like mass-produced and industrial and obviously very in fashion.
While we refuel our coffees, here's a snippet from the next episode with American stained glass conservator and consultant Brianne Van Voorst.
The words are not interchangeable. Restoration is to restore something back to a previous period. In stained glass, that tends to mean the period that it was originally fabricated, so when it was new. Conservation is to conserve what is existing now, with an emphasis on retaining original or existing material rather than trying to fully eliminate the appearance of age. So it's more akin to preservation, if that's a word people are more comfortable with, rather than restoration. We're not changing the object, we're retaining the object, even with all of its marks of age.
Meet us back here in 2 weeks. Until then, let's get back to Ranajay.
So knowing that the family background that you have, your family history, and then your own personal background as a student of politics and public policy, and also somebody who's now going to be almost a patron of whatever happens, at least in your palace, if not in the town. What do you think is the role of patronage when it comes to starting a movement of sort or driving change? I know you've been thinking about some large-scale changes that you want to be involved in, not as an official office bearer, as a part of an structured government organization, but still lending some kind of patronage in the town planning, in preservation. What do you think is the role of patronage?
Patronage is obviously essential to any form of art. I mean, any great artist that you ever read about obviously had one, like, great patron, or lack of a better word, a benefactor behind them who enabled them to carry on with their work, at least back in the day. Obviously, many people attribute the Renaissance to Lorenzo de' Medici. He was a great patron, but if you're talking about the sort of patronage that comes from, I don't know, elected officials, obviously what we're talking about here is the urban regeneration of Rajpipla. That's what you're referring to.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, it's rather simple.
It's rather not simple, okay.
Well, it's rather simple in its outlook. It's a lot more complex to achieve, I suppose. It's part city beautiful movement, part preservation, part making the city more walkable. Just creating like a nice civic space that people can enjoy, deter them from using their cars, or encourage them to, or like make it that nice to walk that they don't really feel like using the cars, sort of improve the street life, plant more trees, reduce the heat island effect, etc., etc. Obviously, easier said than done. Obviously, to push these forth, you do need this right sort of policy. I mean, to the national government's credit, to a degree, I guess they do have the smart city plan, but to what extent it focuses on the important things, again, I'm not aware. I don't know if I'm in a position to comment, seeing as I don't know if I've read enough about it to be in a position to comment. But as a student of policy, obviously, we study a lot of cities abroad where these movements are now gathering momentum. I think Paris, London, and New York are like the prime global examples where they're sort of cutting down on the sort of car users as a heritage preservation movement. And they have improved urban life a lot more. I think studies show that people are spending less, like they're not slaves to their cars anymore. And the money and time that they're saving, they're spending more on retail. They're happier in general, just being in these like more beautiful spaces. And it does tend to improve a lot of metrics that make up the quality of life.
But okay, let's think about it in this way. So given everything that exists right now and that has been planted by the government, with a new airport coming up here, with a new railway station that's pretty close by, that resembles something very alien to where we're at, and of course the statue and everything that the statue brings in terms of economy and tourism and whatever it does to the larger region. But what do you think, or what would you like this place, like your own palace and Rajpipla in general, to be like, say, 10 years from now? How do you see it? If everything was to like fall into place and you were to have your way, and assuming you build all the coalitions you had to, you have all the right people on track, you have everybody on board to do whatever you've been thinking about. And I know you've been talking to a lot of municipal councillors and a lot of tribal leaders and people who work in different industries in the town. But 10 years from now, what's your vision? What would you like this place to be?
I think it's quite paternalistic in its outlook, isn't it? It's sort of to either provide a specific like basic quality of life or encourage certain lifestyle changes. I think maybe I have this sort of paternalistic view based off the family history and how I see the town from that sense. Or as a student of policy, I'm not quite sure. But I think mostly it involves the people of Rajpipla sort of being made aware of just what they have in terms of not just their built environment, but also the natural environment, both of which I think you experienced sort of at the zenith today. It's for them to sort of live a sustainable lifestyle, but also a holistic one, be in complete harmony with the environment. I can elaborate on all those points if you like.
Please do.
But as I said, if the urban regeneration goes through to sort of reduce their car usage, maybe spend their spare time pursuing hobbies instead of just, at the moment, obviously, there aren't too many outlets for leisure in the city as well. I mean, we get into sport. Rajpipla was known for its like sporting heritage back in the day. Polo and tennis, obviously, were the major ones. Maybe get into more sustainable sort of businesses, and most importantly, I think just appreciate the environment and what what history has given them. Just to, as my cousin said today, he seems to consider himself very lucky to be like living in the house that he lives in. So have this like population that is just living in harmony and with gratitude, with respect, and obviously having done all of that. The statue obviously is here for the long run, so I think what's best both for Rajpipla and Kevadia colony sort of to benefit from each other to that extent. The statue obviously brings in a lot of global recognition to the area and brings with it a lot of services and stuff that obviously we would never have been given had the statue not been like the seaplane, the new station, another swanky new airport, I believe that's coming up, of the helipads and fantastic national highways. So I suppose if either Rajpipla or Kevadia colony serve as either a condiment to each other as well in terms of tourism, because obviously one I don't know if is enough. I think they can both benefit just by being like, it can be a mutually beneficial relationship just existing next to each other. And maybe, obviously, this is a bit optimistic, but serve as a sort of model. Rajpipla obviously being rather small, and people might say it's not replicable, but serve as at least a model for other towns to copy, or cities to copy, and see how we sort of prepare ourselves for the future by taking one step back or just having a look at our past.
Do you think the economy of the place changes in a few years? So currently it seems like it's predominantly agricultural with a whole lot of bananas growing around here. But with all the development that's happening 20 kilometers from here, do you think there will be a change in the overall demographic of the place in terms of it becoming more of a service industry? And I don't know what happens to agriculture, because the moment you get people or, bring services around, you by default start thinking about the land and what it does to the overall economy.
I'd assume so. I'd say, obviously, I can't make any predictions just now, but one would have to wait and see how well the statue continues doing in terms of its in terms of the sheer number of tourists that it's attracting. There's obviously the statue itself and the supporting economy that it's surrounded by, like hotels and taxis, restaurants, etc. That people in Rajpipla, I'd suppose, are hoping to find. And I have actually so far found jobs of like business ideas or potential in. So it would obviously largely depend on that. Should the statues numbers go down, I assume it would not look so lucrative anymore to like build a hotel or something over there, or to start a restaurant or a cafe or anything there. So in that sense, I'd assume people would be deterred from jumping prematurely from one business that they have known their entire lifetime to something completely different. The ones who've been in agriculture, I'd assume, and like other businesses obviously locally would, and those who aren't that well off, who maybe cannot start like something new on the side, but continue predominantly being in the same businesses that they're in. Having said that, obviously a lot of land's being bought up here, at least leading up to the town, and being converted into
guest houses and like
commercial use. Yes, yeah. And you do see that. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I suppose environmentally it's never a good thing, but so obviously there is it does run the risk of saturation already. But obviously, statues already surprised us so far with the sheer numbers that it has managed to pull, if the official figures are correct. So it really depends on how its popularity holds through. I believe there is a new one in Maharashtra that's supposed to be even taller. So I don't know if that.
Oh, I don't know about that one.
Oh yeah, I don't know if it's on hold anymore. I haven't obviously read about it recently, but the one in the Arabian Sea. So if that is obviously to take shape, then I suppose ours would lose its sheen. So yeah, it really depends. I'm not quite sure. And then again, there is a bit of gentrification, if I can use that word. Obviously, it's not the same as it is in the Western context, but there are obviously new people moving in. There is a lot of migration to the town. The culture, in a sense, is changing, touching upon a previous topic, seeing as people's beliefs and values change, seeing as everyone is now connected to the internet. So obviously, that sense, I suppose the demographic is changing. The old guard is dying out. COVID obviously had heaved a lot of destruction here. So obviously there are like younger people in power with different views. So I think it's an interesting time. It's an uncertain time, not necessarily in a bad way, but it's a very interesting time to be here. So one just has to wait and watch, I suppose.
And if I were to grill you for like one last question. So you have another year before you graduate from Master in Public Policy from Georgetown, which is so exciting. And I'm hoping you're planning to move back full time. So what's personally next for you and what's next for the palace? I don't know, if I were to come back 5-10 years later, what do you hope this will be like if I walk in? Do you see like a bustling museum? What do you...
Well, I hope I get the firm that I've contacted to actually have finished carrying out their work by then. In their own words, for them to have reinterpreted the past in the palace, and for it to sort of evoke the sort of visceral reaction in you. Hopefully by then, I'm assuming it did already, but even more so by then. Sort of have whatever the larger plan for the place in action, at least part of it, because obviously it's large scale uncertainty, but hopefully things being in motion, because I don't know if 5 to 10 years is enough for everything to change, but at least the sort of Rajpipla Renaissance, as I like to call it, being well and truly underway, and for there to be a visible change in the city, and for us to actually be able to ditch my car completely next trip and just explore on foot, and maybe have more places of recreation around, like more like restaurants and cafes and stuff. And yeah, I think that's what I'd hope one would be able to see should everything go according to plan.
So whenever in town, if you ever happen to visit the Statue of Unity, please just drive by, because I feel like today, the last 3 days have been a game changer in terms of the secret treasure that this town holds. And I think, were it not for our two common friends who are soon getting married, I would probably have never ended up here. So thank you for having me for the last 3 days and for agreeing to be on an architecture podcast and absolutely nailing it because you talk like an architect. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. To quote the signboard of the statue, "Thank you, come again."
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. If you enjoy listening to Architecture of Center, you can now support us on Patreon. We would also love to hear from you. So drop in a hi at our website archofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE.